Well, welcome to 10-Minute Record Reviews, episode 345. And this time I'm going to talk about this record by Art Blakey and his quintet, which includes a number of amazing players: Clifford Brown, Lou Donaldson, Horace Silver, and Curly Russell. A Night at Birdland. This is a 1957 second issue of this particular record. It has the same cover as the original press, but there are some key differences. The West 47th Avenue address, and also the fact that this has a flat edge. Anyway, so this is a second pressing. I think it might be the oldest Blue Note record that I have. The 12-inch version was originally released in 1956. The 10 inches were all put out in 1954, and this has 5 of the 6 tracks which were on the first 2 10-inch releases. This record is one of the founding texts of the Church of Hard Bop. Certainly, in my estimation, one of the most exciting records in the whole jazz canon. There is energy just spilling out of the records every moment. It is not jazz to be played in the background at dinner, and most, if not all, of the players on here are complete jazz legends. In my review of the classic Jazz Messengers record Moanin', which comes out some years after this, I gave a summary of Art Blakey's early life, which was not very happy. He was raised without parents by a family friend. As a drummer, his first big break was playing with the piano player Mary Lou Williams in the 1930s, and then he goes on to join the Fletcher Henderson Orchestra sometime around 1940. When the war came, he was drafted, but he never saw active service because he was injured in what was apparently an unprovoked attack by a policeman in Georgia when he was down there with Henderson. He then goes on to play with a variety of bands during the war. There were lots of places available because people had been drafted. And his most lasting gig, and the place where he comes to most prominence, is his time with Billy Eckstine's orchestra. After the war, he travels to Africa, undergoes a somewhat half-hearted conversion to Islam, takes the name Abdullah ibn Buhaina, but pretty soon after he gets back to the States, he reverts back to his birth name. But he does form a group called the Jazz Messengers, which initially was a practice group, but he also had a smaller subset of that group which would perform, largely of like-minded folks philosophically. This group had the same name, but no other real connection to the much more famous Jazz Messengers small combo of later years. In the early 50s, he got a gig playing with the clarinet player Buddy DeFranco, and this is where he really starts to attract critical attention with his hard-hitting, bomb-dropping style. In fact, so much so that he's voted by downbeat critics as the new star on drums in 1953. He'd been appearing on record since right after the recording ban, right after World War II, but he had rarely done so as a leader, just occasionally. Most of his recordings were with people like James Moody or with Eckstine, but he had made a few tracks as a leader with Blue Note going back to as early as 1946. So by 1953, Art Blakey was pretty well known, at least in New York, and his rising star with the critics led Alfred Line of Blue Note to consider offering him his own recording contract as a leader. That was agreed, but Blakey now needed a band. He knew lots of musicians, of course, because he'd been playing all over town and recording with all kinds of people, but who to approach? One obvious connection with Horace Silver, who, like Blakey, had been bouncing around from band to band and session to session in early 1950s New York. The two of them had been introduced by the trumpet player Kenny Dorham, who had met Silver at a recording session and invites him to come and listen to the early version of Blakey's Jazz Messengers. They did play together quite a few times, both in gigs and also in the recording studio over the next few years. One notorious time they played together was when Silver was playing in Stan Getz's combo, and Getz had a line on a fairly lucrative gig at a fairly exclusive little jazz dinner club called the Round Table on the Upper East Side. This might be the Round Table room which existed and I think still exists at the Algonquin Hotel in New York, but that's a little bit closer to Times Square anyway. Wherever it was, they show up. The whole idea was to play music which very well-heeled patrons could listen to while they ate dinner and chatted, so you basically could not play loud. Well, the problem was that Getz had asked Silver to get a drummer in, and Silver had contacted Blakey, and Blakey showed up, and essentially, in the spirit of Spinal Tap, they became one of New York's loudest bands. Didn't get the gig. But Silver and Blakey kept playing together. They played along with Percy Heath in a Miles Davis recording for Blue Note, which ends up being Miles Davis Volume 3. And so when it comes time to make this record, Blakey gets hold of Silver, he gets hold of the bass player Curly Russell, gets hold of the alto sax whiz Lou Donaldson. Donaldson, Blakey, and Silver all knew each other from various gigs and various sessions. They'd all played together on Donaldson's first outing for Blue Note, New Faces, New Sounds. And Donaldson and Blakey had also played with a trumpet player, a guy called Clifford Brown, who by 1953 was the talk of the town in the New York jazz world, despite the fact that he had rarely at that point played in New York. Alfred Lyne had heard about Brown, and so he and Art Blakey decide to drive to Brown's house, which was not in New York, but in Wilmington, Delaware, to ask him if he'd make a record with them. And they show up on his doorstep. Brown's flattered, and he agrees. They entered rehearsals in January 1954, and when they got together, the whole group was blown away by Brown's capacity. He could play all night. He had this strong lip like Dizzy. He basically could play anything. And apparently, when Miles came by, he left essentially with his tail between his legs. The whole band was just feeding off each other's energy, and very soon it was time to make this record. They were booked into Birdland for 2 weeks in February 1954, and the idea was to make a live record, which was a really rare thing at the time. There had been bootleg copies of earlier jazz recordings, which were done in concerts or on the radio and so on, which had found their way onto record. Marion McPartland had made her live record at the Hickory House in 1953. But aside from those examples, it was basically not done at that point. It's produced by Alfred Lyne, and unsurprisingly, it's recorded and engineered by Rudy Van Gelder, who had to load up his car with all his stuff in Hackensack and drive over to the big city to set up in Birdland. And Birdland had not actually hosted a recording there either, so it's new territory for everybody. It's remarkable how good this record sounds when you consider how novel the whole situation was. Blakey's on drums, Brown's on trumpet, Silver's on piano, Curly Russell's on bass, and Lou Donaldson is on alto sax. Of all these players, Russell's probably the only one who isn't an out and out jazz legend because he didn't really record much, if at all, as a leader. Wikipedia says he was born in New York. He wasn't. He was born in Trinidad. And despite the fact that he didn't record as a leader, he has a huge recording catalog. He's got something like 800 recording credits, and he was there all the way through the bebop era and had been recording basically for 10 years before he makes this date. The introduction, which is captured on the record famously, is by the long-standing but short of stature MC at Birdland, Pee Wee Marquette, who was from New Orleans, but from 1949 to 1965 was a fixture at Birdland. He's also infamous for extorting money from the musicians who played at the club, threatening to mispronounce their names unless they paid up. Silver refused initially to pay up and was known on the bandstand as Horace Silver till he relented. Lester Young, the sax player, used to refer to Marquette as half a mother. And rumor has it that bribery has something to do with the name of the record because it was supposed to be called, apparently, the Birdland All Stars, but Blakey tipped Marquette and asked him to say that it was his band, which of course he does on the recording. This is rumor, it's not substantiated. The group plays the 2 weeks at Birdland. February 21st, 1954 is the date that all of the material was recorded. They then played one more week in Philly, and then after that, somewhat amazingly, couldn't find work. And pretty soon thereafter, Max Roach comes in, steals away Clifford Brown to front his own group, and that spelled the end for what was probably the earliest supergroup of hard bop. After the famous and pretty funny introduction, side one starts with Split Kick, which is a Silver composition, kicking off with Donaldson, who is always so funky and so earthy. There's some criticism of this record because people find that Donaldson is too bluesy and doesn't really fit. That just seems like kind of cerebral jazz head criticism. I think he's amazing on here. He's got such a rich tone, captured by Van Gelder. Ditto for Clifford Brown. His tone is just so tangible coming out of the speakers. Once in a While is a standard, which, as Blakey announces, was chosen by Brown as his signature piece. Brown's playing is just gorgeous here, but also honorable mention to Silver's comping. I've mentioned before, I think maybe even last week, that when Silver comps, he does more than comp. He really sets the tone for the whole recording. This is maybe one of the very best examples of what he can do. The last track on side one is Quicksilver by Horace Silver. It's a bebopish number. It roars ahead at like 300 beats a minute. Silver, strangely, seems a little unready for his solo when his time comes, but he warms up in a hurry. Another great track. Side two starts with A Night in Tunisia by Dizzy Gillespie, and this was a track which Blakey would record and play many times in his career, and the anecdote he tells you at the beginning tells you a little bit about why that's the case. The final track on the record is Silver's Mera, which is maybe the least impressive of what is a very impressive set of tracks. It has more Brown soloing, sometimes effortless, sometimes totally explosive, and Blakey winds up before they break into this jaunty little tune, which I guess was probably their outro tune for their set. First of all, if you're a hard bop fan, I don't think this is a record you can do without. It's got imperfections, which you not only expect, but actually kind of hope for, I think, in a live recording. But most of all, this record is exciting because it feels very much like ground zero for hard bop. It's an early example of live club jazz played by legends, and for me, it's 5 out of 5 stars.